long before the very first European, Spanish, and Portuguese settlers reached the continent of Africa. Multiple nations were already forming and becoming large, influential, and highly sophisticated empires across the African continent. If you go up to the north of Africa, to the very horn of Africa, there was the Cairo Empire. If you go just beside Cairo, Libya had already been in full existence and was an empire of its own. If you go down southwest, you will find empires like the Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, which had already been influenced by the trans-Saharan slave trade and has seen a lot of Saharan relationships happening within that region. If you move even to the middle of Africa, if you move even to Central Africa, down to Southern Africa, more and more kingdoms and empires had already formed. For instance, you had the Monomotapa Empire, you equally had the Zulu Empire, you had the Great Zimbabwe Empire, but our focus for today is one of the great empires that has seen less representation in history, yet has seen one of the devastating hands of European imperial touch on the continent. This is the Benin Empire. And long before the very first European and Portuguese ships set sail and reached the Bight of Benin, a civilization was already formulating itself in the Benin quietly. And that civilization was perfecting the art of formulating a city-state, a civilization in the tropical jungles of what will now become known as the country of Nigeria. Mind you, Nigeria was only formulated in 1914 by the amalgamation of Lord Lugard of the Northern and Southern Protectorate, and Lady Flora Shaw called the amalgamated entities Niger areas around the Niger. That's what the name Nigeria means. And so to understand the Benin Empire, you have to look past the jungle tropes and see a centralized and a sophisticated government system which emerged around 900 AD. It began with what is called in the Benin Empire the Ogiso, O-G-I-S-O. The Ogiso in Nigerian Benin cosmology are the kings of the sky. And the kings of the sky in the Benin cosmology laid the social foundations of the Edo people and formulated the very core of what made the empire. The empire, however, truly became very transformed, sophisticated, and developed under the Oba dynasty. The Obas weren't just monarchs or power maniacs who just wanted to exert control over their constituents. The Obas were the chief engineers of a society that was highly civilized and advanced, so much that it treated the Portuguese and the early British expeditioners who arrived in that part of the continent as trade peers, not as superiors or masters of any sort. The Obas built a kingdom that was filled by trade, the trade of pepper, the trade of ivory, and a high level of metallurgical skill. Metallurgical skill simply translates to the study and understanding of the bending of iron, the casting of bronze and precious metals, the mining and processing of natural resource which sat under the feet of the great Benin Empire. And all of that genius was done when the entirety of the world was trying to wrap its head around what it means to be human and what it means to be civilized. If you were to walk through 15th century Benin City, you wouldn't see random clusters of houses and huts. You would rather see a city that is designed with mathematical logic and highly systemic structural logic that wouldn't be formalized anywhere in the world or anywhere in the West for another 5 centuries. In fact, ethno-mathematician whose name is Ron Iglash, in his groundbreaking study of the indigenous African design, proved that the Benin was a masterpiece of fractal geometry. Iglash's work is vital because it shatters the idea that African urbanism was organic and totally accidental. He showed that the Edo people used recursive scaling, where the layer of a single house mirrored the layer of the palace of the Oba, or the palace of the king. And the palace of the king also mirrored the layer of the entire city. It was a self-similar grid of 120-foot wide boulevards. And all of the boulevards meet at the very right angles, maintained with a high level of cleanliness and order that stunned early Dutch travelers who had arrived on the continent. But the most undeniable evidence of the advancement of the kingdom and empire of the Benin was written on the earth itself. The Iya, or the Great Wall of Benin, for a long time held a great record of architectural wonder. The scale of this project was underestimated, but archaeologist and historian Graham Kona used stratigraphic research to reveal the sheer human effort involved in building the Iya, the Great Wall. Kona estimated that building the Great Wall of Benin required over 150 million man-hours of labor. To put 150 million man-hours of labor into perspective, you will have to understand that Edo people, the Edo Empire and workers moved more earth to build and protect their city wall than the ancient Egyptians moved to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. Even more impressive is the mapping work of archaeologist Patrick Darling. Patrick Darling, in his massive multi-layer survey of the Nigerian landscape, documented a staggering 16 kilometers of interconnected walls and moats. His work is the cornerstone of what I'm doing here, the reconstruction of a narrative, because it proves that this wasn't just a fence. It was a continental, massive-scale civil engineering project which was used for land management, defense mechanism, and building of legal boundaries. It is by far and by volume the largest earthwork ever constructed by hands. But also, what you have to understand, this genius was not an isolated event. The walls of Benin are part of just a wider array of African architectural marvel and revolution. If you go up north to Kaduna, the state of Kaduna, and the state of Zaria, where 15 kilometers of mud brick fortification defended the Hausa state, and if you also go down south of the African continent to the Great Zimbabwe enclosure, you will see many more wonders. When you look at the structures through the lens of modern engineering, you will realize that African states were often ahead of the world in urban planning and mass mobilization. The colonial narrative, however, didn't just ignore these architectural wonders. It tried to completely erase them, or in some cases, undermine them. However, they still remain physical proof that Africa was home to some of the most advanced technologies in the medieval era. The walls of Benin especially, as much as they shielded, protected, and provided confines of a city-state to the Empire of Benin, the walls also protected something special, something treasured by the Empire of Benin. They protected the famous Benin bronze. They tell a story of their own. The craftsmanship and the 1897 British expedition that sought to dismantle this entire history are exactly what I'm trying to uncover in my telling of African story differently. Next, we are going to deep dive more into the history of this Benin Empire and uncover unsettling stories about the Benin Empire, especially about the 1897 British expedition, which looted over 5,000 artifacts and sold and stored them in different Western cities. Today, those artifacts sit as objects of aesthetic wonders in every part of the world except in Nigeria, in the Benin Empire, where they actually belong.